We're dealing with a number of difficult issues in the world, but most specifically right now the coronavirus, about which you may have a lot of doubts, concerns, insecurities. What I want to do in today's video is to discuss dealing with doubt and how we can come to a more firm idea of knowledge about the world of how we should proceed. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So today's discussion is going to be more related to, let's say, my background, that is to say, it's coming from my background from philosophy of science, from epistemology, which is the study of how we know what we know, rather than so much out of Buddhism, out of the Buddha Dharma, although I will be discussing some of that as well, how it applies in this particular situation. So, but if you're not so interested in, shall we say, epistemology and science, this may not be your video. We'll get into some controversies later on. So, if that's not interesting to you, move on, get to the next one. I'll be coming out with one in a few days. I'll be talking about the coronavirus first, and then we'll get onto the more general question about doubts in our lives and certain particular cases where the right approach to epistemology might be helpful. That is to say, the right approach to knowledge might be helpful. When it comes to the coronavirus, I mean, we're all having to deal with this extended, or as many of us, with this extended lockdown, at least, around where I am there, we're supposed not to be doing a whole lot of things. And this can become wearing, and I think it does for many of us, that we're sort of feel a little bit like caged animals in the sense that we're required to spend our hours, our days in a relatively small environment, whether that be within a house or, going out once in a while to do errands. But even those, we can't do the ones that we would like to do necessarily. We may have to wait in lines to go to the grocery store in a way that we never had to before. It takes much longer. There may be many things that we would like to do that we can't. And what often happens in this kind of situation is that the mind gets into a kind of obsessive rumination. We have perhaps extra time on our hands. We're forced to wait in ways that we never did before. And this, in early Buddhism, there's a word for it in Pali. The word is papancha, which is often translated as mental proliferation. That's a sort of a concept that is sort of foreign to many of us because we don't have the same kind of idea in English. But basically what it means is, among other things, but basically a mental rumination, this kind of obsessive mental thinking that sort of goes around and around in circles, or that keeps coming back, whether, no matter what we do, it keeps coming back. And indeed, one of the ways that we get into mental proliferation is that we are without our normal distractions. In other words, for many of us, we use the distractions of life, the constant busyness, the going here and there and doing this and that, essentially to distract us from the way our mind ordinarily operates, which is with this kind of obsessive rumination, this kind of papancha, this difficult kind of mental state. And since we don't like that, we distract ourselves. Hence, when the distractions go away, we're left with this state of mind that we don't find particularly pleasant. And one of the ways when we don't find ourselves in a particularly pleasant state is that the ruminations can take a different turn. And they can turn towards an idea of finding a way out of this. And if the way out isn't, shall we say, an ordinary, standard, easy way, we may start thinking in more dark and angry kind of mindsets about different ways, that perhaps somebody is to blame for this, perhaps somebody's making a mistake, perhaps I really don't have to do this. Perhaps this is all a big conspiracy. Now, I expect that most of you are not thinking like that, but it is something that is certainly in the air nowadays. And there's a word for, or a phrase, I should say, for this kind of, the kind of thinking that I've just described. It's called, or it's an example of what we might call motivated reasoning. Now, what does that mean? I have a definition here. Motivated reasoning uses emotionally biased reasoning to produce justifications or make decisions that are most desired, rather than those that accurately reflect the evidence. So we want a particular end, and instead of looking at the evidence and trying to figure out in a more objective fashion how we might achieve that end, or whether perhaps that end is really not achievable right now, we might have to wait, instead of doing that, we start from what we want and reason backwards. We say, well, if that's what we want, then I will construct a world in which that is achievable, and sort of reality be damned. That's sort of the general approach. So if we want a particular thing, let's say like going out to a restaurant or something, well, then we figure out how that is possible to be achieved. And if somebody's saying it isn't, then we just simply assume that they're wrong. Or if there's something we don't like, a perfect example being, let's say, getting a vaccine. Nobody likes getting a vaccine. There are certain people who will then use that to reason backwards that vaccines are bad for you. And as a result, they don't need them. These are all examples of motivated reasoning that can be a problem, can become a problem, both in the local level, on the individual level, and in a societal level. When we turn to Buddhism, there's one very famous sutta where the Buddha discusses approaches that we can take to reasoning. In this sutta, the Buddha gave a discourse to a group of people who were not familiar with his Dharma, and in general were in a quandary because they had had discussions, talks by different philosophers, different teachers from different kinds of backgrounds in the past, and they didn't know who to believe. This, some of you may know, is the famous Discourse to the Calamus. Well, actually, it's a discourse which has become famous in more recent years, because many of us find resonances with our own approach to knowledge. And what the Buddha did in this discourse is that he sort of commiserated with them. He said, yes, I mean, I agree that it can be difficult to come up with a correct view of the world, shall we say. But the Buddha said that there are certain techniques that we often use to come at a belief, to come at what we believe is knowledge, that are not correct. He says, for example, that many people come at this through tradition. And the Buddha says we should not accept tradition as a valid source of knowledge. There are certain aspects of authority, the way that we deal with authorities, that the Buddha says are not good roots for knowledge. And the Buddha also says, and this is kind of interesting for many of us with a philosophical background, that pure reasoning itself is not a valid source of knowledge. And so what the Buddha tells these kalamas, these people, is that insofar as you're looking for knowledge through these three routes, you're not going to find it. And indeed, any of these three, if we ourselves rely on these sources of evidence, which many of us perhaps do, we're going to find ourselves in these kinds of doubts from time to time because these sources of knowledge are not particularly probative. They don't really lead anywhere that's very good. For example, I mean, we all know that tradition, which is one main source of knowledge for many people, tradition often is incorrect. Traditions get old. That is to say, traditions are based on oftentimes nothing clear. They're not based on any real. They're not based on anything that we can really pin down as far as knowledge goes. So we want something more secure than simply somebody saying that, well, they've done this in the past or they believe this in the past. When it comes to sources of authority, the Buddha in particular talks about basically people with a rhetorical gift, we might describe it that way, people who sound good, who are telegenic or photogenic, we might say nowadays. Clearly, these sorts of people are not people who we necessarily should follow. Indeed, my own kind of rule of thumb, as much as anything, is to say that the sorts of people that one finds on television, the kinds of people that we find discussing facts or the news, are often put there simply because they have a good voice. They're very good speakers. They're very good public speakers. They look nice oftentimes. They're picked for a particular kind of physical appearance. And we should be very suspect of information being presented to us in that way. In ancient Greek philosophy, the philosopher Plato talked a lot about the sophists and about sophistry. And sophistry is basically his way of talking about, his way of describing a group of people who are very good at convincing other people of certain things without knowing about those things themselves. In other words, they can, whatever they want to convince you of, they can convince you of because they're very good with language. They're very good rhetorically. And Plato, I shouldn't say obviously, but Plato was very much against this sort of thing. He felt that this was a real problem societally. We also, the Buddha says, should avoid believing people just simply because they're our teacher. In other words, in ancient India, the role of the guru is the word for teacher, the role of the guru was very, very strong. And oftentimes people would simply accept something that their teacher said simply on the teacher's hearsay. In other words, just because the teacher said it. And the Buddha is very clear that simply because somebody is your teacher does not necessarily mean that they're going to be correct in what they say. Now, the third thing that the Buddha discussed was what we might call pure reasoning. And the Buddha says we shouldn't believe something based on pure reasoning. Now, for many of us philosophers, that will seem surprising. But we've already seen the problem with motivated reasoning. That is to say, it's very easy to rationalize ourselves into positions that we want to hold rather than positions that are actually true. So if we want it to be such and so the case, it's very easy really to come up with an argument which at least papers over the problems for ourselves. It's kind of a form of self-delusion. And if we live our lives that way by thinking, oh, well, I've got this pure reason, purely reasoned kind of argument for something, you can end up putting yourself into situations where you really don't know what you think you do. But then the important question becomes, if we don't do those things, if we're not supposed to pursue knowledge through those routes, then how do we pursue knowledge? How do we move forward? How do we overcome our doubts like the Calamus had? And here the Buddha says, basically, that we should instead pursue a more pragmatic, empirical approach. And the Buddha says that we should ask about something, does pursuing it lead to our long-term benefit? Or instead, does it lead to our long-term harm? And this is, I think, a deeper question for ourselves. But again, the problem is going to come up for many of us that we don't know whether the thing is going to lead to our harm or benefit. We may have suppositions about one or the other, but those suppositions can often lead us astray. So the Buddha has a different part of his answer, which is to look to the wise, to look to the knowledgeable in our society to help in this kind of quest. And here is, I think, where the rubber sort of hits the road. Now, the Pali word here is vinyu, which means either intelligent or learned or wise. It's kind of an amalgam of all of these things. There is a distinction I would like to make between being intelligent and being wise, or between, we might say, knowledge and wisdom. We'll get to that later on. But for now, we can run them together in this kind of circumstance. And we might want to say that we ourselves may not know whether a particular approach, action, is to our benefit or to our harm, but the wise person is going to know that, or at least is going to have a better handle on that than we will ourselves. That's part of really what it is to be wise. But then, of course, the question comes down to, who are the wise? Who are these people who are intelligent, learned, and wise? That's really where the problem happens. How do we find them? Now, in old days, there might really be a sense to which there were a certain small number of people in a society who were the wise, who might have encompassed, in some sense, all of wisdom or all of knowledge. For instance, in Aristotle, who was a great philosopher in ancient Greece, in his compendium of works, he really did make an attempt to encompass, in some sense, all of knowledge, or at the very least, all of the knowledge in his particular culture, all of the knowledge of the world that they had gathered up from all of their different studies. And indeed, in olden days, centuries ago, philosophers in general were scientists. In other words, there was no distinction between being a philosopher of the kind we think of nowadays and being what was called a natural philosopher. They were the same thing. A natural philosopher was simply a philosopher who also looked at nature, looked at empirical things. And there was a possibility several centuries ago that somebody could at least hope to encompass in their own lifetime all of knowledge and become wise and knowledgeable in that sense. And in the Buddha's day, this might have been true as well. In the ancient world, there really was a sense of the wise and knowledgeable being a certain, perhaps encompassed by a particular person. However, this isn't the case now, and really hasn't been the case for well over a century, perhaps 2 centuries. It's the problem here is that scientific knowledge, our accumulation of information and knowledge through the sciences, has become so vast and deep that it's no longer possible, and again hasn't been possible for a long time, for any single person to have a handle on all of it, indeed on even nearly all of it. As a result, over the decades and centuries, science has become more and more compartmentalized. So what happens is that when it comes to a particular topic, there are going to be a group of scientists, perhaps hundreds or even thousands, who know that particular topic very deeply, whereas other scientists from other fields may really not know anything about it very much at all. Now, this is the situation that we find ourselves in now. So when it comes to something like a viral pandemic, our only recourse when we're looking to the opinions of the wise and knowledgeable is to look to those scientists whose speciality is in viral pandemics, who deal with viral illness, who deal with perhaps public policy, who deal again with pandemics, these kinds of things. There will be scientists with expertise in these kinds of topics, and they will be different from scientists who have expertise in other topics. The same is true, for example, of another hot button issue in global warming. If you want to know about global warming, you have to go to those scientists whose careers are built around, whose lives have been spent investigating just those topics, in particular climatologists, climate scientists. This is another area of vast and deep motivated reasoning, a lot of it, in fact, paid for by people who have money to be made if global warming is false. And indeed, some of these are the same people who financed the idea of cigarettes being good for you. Some of the same people are involved in both, where the cigarette companies tried to pretend that smoking was fine, was not unhealthy, and put out a lot of false information about that. And motivated reasoning can be extremely convincing. And I think I would like to talk a little bit about one of the ways it can be, which is that it uses some of what I've already been discussing to get across its message. That is the message of a motivated reasoning, an example of motivated reasoning. One of the ways that it does this is by using science. In any scientific discipline, there are going to be a range of opinions. I think we all know this. If you have, let's say, a group of several hundred or thousand scientists who are expert in a particular field, there's going to be always a range of different opinions within that field about the subject matter. There are going to be many, most, who are within, should we say, the mainstream of that field, but then there's going to be other people who are on the fringe, who have relatively unusual kinds of opinions. That is, it's always possible to find dissenting voices from any particular claim that's being made in a field of science. And if there's some particular opinion that you want to get across, it will most likely be possible to find some scientist or other, given the vast scope of the sciences and given the vast number of people involved, it will always be possible, or almost always be possible, to find either one or a small handful of scientists who will be willing to support it with you. And this is the tactic that people who are trying to get across aspects of motivated reasoning will use. They will look to the fringe scientists to support their position. They will say, I have a scientist who supports my position, and will oftentimes get them on the news, pay them, so on. That is how a lot of this material gets done. Indeed, there are scientists even now who don't believe that the speed of light is a constant. There are scientists who are creationists. Indeed, there are several hundred scientists that were organized or named by some particular creationist organization who supported creationism. And in response, scientists who were opposed to creationism were able to find even more scientists with the first name Dave or something like that who were not creationists. So the point here is that it's easy to find people on the fringe who support any particular position. However, what's the point here? The point here is that the vast majority of fringe scientists are not going to be correct. There's no way for them to be all correct because taken in aggregate, they disagree with each other as well. Now, we may hear about one particular group of them because they've been supported by some organization that wants to put something across, but there's going to be dozens, hundreds of others that aren't supported by any particular organization, but we just don't hear about. Most of these fringe scientists are not going to be correct, and in the long term are going to be forgotten. And that is the point. So from the position of us as lay people, it does not serve to support the position of a fringe scientist. What's the alternative? The alternative is to follow what's called the scientific consensus. So nowadays, the proper epistemic or source of knowledge, who are the wise, the learned, the knowledgeable, those are, as far as we're concerned, the scientific consensus, the consensus scientists, the people who are at the center of what is believed within a particular scientific discipline to be the way things are. The consensus, as we might say, is the middle path of the sciences. It's in between all of the extremes. It's in between all of the fringe positions. It's in the middle. And we might even say that not only is that the most secure ground, and as far as knowledge goes for us, but that in a certain sense, when it comes to empirical matters anyway, that is, matters of investigation of the world, there can be no more secure ground than to look at what the majority of practicing investigators into that particular phenomenon happen to believe. That is where we're most likely to be correct if we're going to follow them. And so therefore, it's always important to be very wary of any argument that relies upon a fringe scientist for its support. A lot of people fall into this trap, even in Buddhism. And so it's important to realize that it is a trap. Now, some people are going to say, correctly, that sometimes fringe scientists and fringe science becomes mainstream, becomes consensus. One of the most famous examples of this is with plate tectonics back in the middle of the last century. Plate tectonics, this idea of geology, that the continents ride around on plates around the Earth, they actually move, was considered in the early part of the 20th century something that was laughable. It was considered completely fringe and unbelievable. And a number of, a very small number really, of scientists, one or two frankly, really pushed it for a long time. But the point is that it did not take forever. It only took a few decades between people beginning to push this seriously as an alternative and it becoming consensus. It took a few decades. It was a difficult transition. There was, of course, a lot of acrimony within the sciences. I shouldn't say the science, but within geology, there was a lot of acrimony. But eventually, the evidence became overwhelming. The evidence built over several decades and became overwhelming, and now it is consensus that the continents ride around on plates, although there are indeed still some geologists nowadays who are now fringe, who don't believe in plate tectonics. So it does happen that fringe science can become mainstream, can become consensus. But again, this is something extremely rare. When we look at the total number of fringe science positions out there, the vast majority of them don't amount to anything. So the point is not to bet on a fringe science position, and particularly not for motivated reasons. That is to say, to be careful when there's a particular feature of the world, some particular thing that we want to be true, and so we find ourselves looking for the scientist who happens to believe it, even though they happen to be one in a million. That is, again, an example of motivated reasoning. It's the kind of thing we want to avoid. In our problem with doubt, therefore, we've gone from a general idea of not knowing what to believe to following a particular empirical and pragmatic path, to finding who the wise people are, to realizing, okay, that is, at least when it comes to empirical matters, matters of the world, matters of investigation, that we look to the scientists in a particular field who study this, we look to the consensus within that field. Now we come to the question of how to know what that consensus is. Now, we aren't experts ourselves, and that can be indeed difficult. In many matters, there isn't a consensus, in which case we're really up to our own devices again. But in many matters, there are. And one of the ways, or there are several ways to come to try to know the consensus within a scientific field. Some of the best ways are to look to major scientific organizations to see if they have position papers on a particular matter. Examples being the World Health Organization, being a wonderful global scientific organization, health organization, and see what their position paper is, let's say, on the coronavirus. And I have a link down below in the show notes if you want to look at the World Health Organization's position papers. They're written for the general public. Another example is with global warming, to look to scientific organizations, in particular organizations involved in climatology, and what their position papers are. And there is a very, very good wiki article on this, a wiki article that I've been familiar with for years, which lists all of the scientific organizations that have position papers on global warming and notes that 100% of them support the position that global warming is real and that it's caused by humanity or caused by humans. I believe it's 100% on that as well. At the very least, it's the vast majority. And I'll put that in a link down below as well. Now, in this video, I have spoken of wisdom and knowledge as though they were the same thing. I've sort of glossed them as running together. And indeed, they do run together in these kinds of empirical matters. To be knowledgeable about something, I should say to be wise about something involves being knowledgeable about it. Wisdom, however, is a separate kind of ethical insight, shall we say, into the world, into particular topics in the world. So these are different kinds of abilities, knowledge and wisdom. And I did an earlier video on the distinction between these two, which I think is, it was a video from a while ago, but I think it really is something that we should keep in mind when it comes to knowledge and when it comes to our own doubts. So I'll put a link to it up on the screen here. I hope you find it useful. Thanks so much to all of you and to all of my patrons over on Patreon, and I'll catch you on the next one of these videos. Meanwhile, all of you be well.